Hi, I'm Seth Ballhorn with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. This short presentation will provide an overview of the Skagit Wildlife Area Island Unit Alternatives Analysis process. In this presentation, I'll go over the history of the site, what led to the alternatives analysis, provide an overview of the alternatives analysis itself, and let you know how you can provide input. The island unit is located on two diked islands in a tidally influenced reach of the South Fork of the Skagit River. WDFW has owned and managed the islands since the 1950s to produce crops for overwintering waterfowl and as a public hunting area. Since the 1950s, additional considerations related to the site have come up. In the late 1990s, when Chinook salmon populations were recognized as declining, an alternatives analysis was completed to assess restoration of the site. In 2000, the Deepwater Slough project was completed and approximately 200 acres were restored to estuary. Since 2000, additional issues have come up that WDFW must respond to. First, the infrastructure that supports current management is in disrepair and is at risk of failing. Dikes have become damaged by floods, and dike repairs have become more difficult to fund and permit. Tide gates and water control structures are not performing as designed and are at risk of failure. If and when this infrastructure fails, it will not be possible to manage the island unit as it is currently managed, and it will not be fully functional estuary habitat for Chinook and other fish and wildlife. Doing nothing is not an option for the agency. In addition to issues on the site, the agency must also respond to changes across the landscape. The listing of Puget Sound Chinook as threatened under the Endangered Species Act and the identification of estuary as priority habitat raised the importance of estuary restoration in the Skagit Delta. In response to this listing, the island unit was identified as priority area for estuary restoration in several planning documents and agreements. Additional ESA listing of species directly and indirectly tied to estuary habitats have occurred since the late 90s, namely bull trout, steelhead trout, and southern resident killer whale. Lastly, the effects of climate change have become better understood in the past few decades. At the island unit, sea level rise and changing river flows are anticipated to put additional strain on infrastructure, potentially causing more frequent and severe damage to dike and tide gates, and reducing drainage capacity. To evaluate options, the department is conducting an alternatives analysis, which is a planning tool used to evaluate a range of choices or alternatives relative to a set of common criteria. The alternatives range from no restoration to restoration of the entire site. This effort is a high-level analysis using landscape-level assessment tools and existing data. The analysis is conducted by a multidisciplinary team of WDFW staff in the Habitat and Wildlife programs. Technical memos with more detailed analysis were prepared by issue area experts and are included as an appendices to the report. A project advisory group was formed to provide input at multiple points during the analysis, and members included stakeholders, tribal, and governmental representatives. I'll now explain the four alternatives we evaluate. Alternative 1 would involve replacing tide gates on both islands. Dikes would be raised to ensure they can withstand near-term sea level rise. In this alternative, 0 acres are restored to estuary and 270 acres are maintained under current management, including 141 acres of enhanced and managed forage. In alternative 2, the tide gate on the west island would be replaced. Dikes on the west island would be raised to ensure that they withstand near-term sea level rise, and problem erosion areas would be addressed. The east island would be restored by removing the dike and constructing channels. In this alternative, 170 acres would be restored to estuary, and 100 acres would be maintained under current management, including 54 acres of enhanced or managed winter waterfowl forage production. Alternative 3 maintains current management on a portion of each island and makes use of existing features for setback dikes. Dikes would be removed in the areas to be restored, and tide gates would be replaced on both islands within setback dikes. All remaining dikes would be raised to ensure they withstand near-term sea level rise, and erosion areas on dikes that are not moved would be addressed. This would restore estuary on the lowest elevation areas. Channels would be constructed in areas restored. In this alternative, 110 acres would be restored to estuary and 160 acres would be maintained under current management, including 81 acres of enhanced and managed winter waterfowl forage production. Alternative 4 would involve removing all tide gates and dikes to restore tides and river flows to both islands, and channels would be constructed throughout the site. In this alternative, 270 acres would be restored to estuary and 0 acres would be maintained under current management. Criteria are intended to capture the primary factors WDFW needs to consider when comparing alternatives. They include WDFW policies, agreements and obligations, costs and funding, fish and wildlife needs, community values, and climate change resilience. Here's the summary rating system we used. As we looked at each alternative relative to each criterion, we asked, would there be substantial positive or negative changes, positive or negative change, some positive effects and some negative effects, or comparable to existing conditions? Some criteria did not fit the rating system. In those cases, alternate rating systems are explained. All summary ratings are relative to current conditions, and it's worth noting that a rating of negative change or substantial negative change does not mean there is no value left in a given criterion. There are 2 slides that capture the analysis and summary ratings. This is the first. You can see 2 of the larger categories of criteria on this slide: WDFW policies and agreements and obligations. The policies category captures the purpose of department lands, policies related to salmon and steelhead, protecting and restoring wetlands, and what's called the Conservation Initiative, and lastly, our statewide conservation goals. 3 are general enough that they do not differentiate between alternatives. Both the salmon and steelhead and wetlands policies do differentiate between alternatives. Through the lens of these policies, restoration is beneficial. Agreements and obligations include acquisition funding and funding for this alternatives analysis. Migratory bird management and 2 criteria related to restoration and agriculture make up the remaining criteria in these categories. Alternatives analysis funding and migratory bird management do not differentiate between the alternatives. For acquisition funding obligations, because any restoration would involve changes at the site, additional discussions with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will be needed in the subsequent project planning phase if one of these alternatives is selected. Due to the need for this additional discussion, alternatives 2 through 4 were given to be determined. For both House Bill 1418, which prioritizes restoration of public lands, and the Skagit Tidegate Fish Initiative, which provides credits for tidegate maintenance and repairs in exchange for estuary restoration, restoration is considered beneficial. This is the second slide to capture the analysis and summary ratings. The larger categories of criteria on this slide are costs and funding, fish and wildlife needs, community interests, and climate resilience. Within costs and funding, we assess construction and operation and maintenance costs. Only construction costs differentiated between alternatives, with restoration being the most likely to be funded. Fish and wildlife needs included Endangered Species Act listed Chinook and southern resident killer whale, food fish and game fish, and waterfowl and shorebirds. For all criteria except waterfowl, we expect restoration to provide a benefit. Waterfowl populations at a landscape scale are not expected to be impacted, except that they will rely less on publicly owned lands for forage. Community interests include agriculture, passive recreation, fishing, and waterfowl hunting. For passive recreation, we did not differentiate between alternatives. For agriculture, restoration at the island unit is considered a benefit. Recreational fishing is also expected to benefit from restoration. However, estuary restoration was determined to be a negative impact to waterfowl hunting. Climate change resilience is the last criteria we considered. Removing infrastructure that exacerbates flooding upstream and will face increasing damage with sea level rise and changing river hydrology was considered a benefit under this criteria. We encourage people to review the draft report and technical memos, which are available on DFW's website. The publication of this draft alternatives analysis report initiates a public comment period, and WDFW invites the public to comment on the content of this draft report. This 30-day public comment period will be from November 16th to December 16th. There are several ways to comment. The easiest way is an online web form available at the DFW website. People can also email or mail their comments. In addition, we are hosting a virtual open house meeting on December 2nd between 6 and 8 p.m. Members of the public will have the opportunity to provide public comments on a webinar with call-in options. Registration for that virtual open house is available online. After the comment period ends on December 16th, WDFW will review comments. A final alternatives analysis report that identifies a preferred alternative will then be prepared. We expect that this will be released sometime in January of 2021. Thank you for taking the time to review this presentation. We encourage you to read the report on our website and provide comments. Thanks.